El Salvador is considered one of the most dangerous countries in the world. It's been this way for many years with over 60 homicides per every 100,000 residents. This homicide rate rivals that of war-torn nations like Syria and even surpasses the peak of the homicide rate in the US in the early 90s. The gang culture in El Salvador is so ingrained into society that it was actually banned by the current president in 2018. But how did El Salvador become so violent, and what role do gangs play in all of this? Welcome to my channel. Today we'll be answering these questions and many more. So let's begin. The first thing that you need to understand about the gang culture in El Salvador is that they were always there. In fact, the country used to be very stable. Until a military coup d'etat in 1979. This sparked the Salvadoran Civil War between the military government and leftist guerrillas. While the war would last only 9 years, its effects on the nation would stretch far beyond its conclusion. Gangs played a major role in the conflict, with entire neighborhoods supporting them. And by the end of the war, it was clear that these gangs would not disappear when the fighting ended. Two of the most prominent gangs that formed during this period were the Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, and the Barrio 18. We are going to start with MS-13. MS-13 was founded in Los Angeles in the early 1980s by refugees from the Salvadoran Civil War. The refugees had fled to the US in the late 70s and early 80s, and by the time they reached LA, the Salvadoran Civil War was still raging on. Most of the refugees who fled to the US were poor and had no other choice but to join gangs to protect themselves. After all, the US was a whole new place for them. They didn't know anyone, and getting picked on was almost inevitable. But there was another reason why these refugees fled to the US. It's because in El Salvador, there was already an existing draft for the military. If these refugees returned home, they would be forced to fight against their own family members, friends, and neighbors. To escape this unfortunate reality, they created MS-13. The gang became extremely violent, committing numerous crimes across Los Angeles County. They gained quite a bit of notoriety after they murdered a rival gang member and then attempted to murder a judge who set him free. As tensions grew between the gang and law enforcement, they decided to relocate back to El Salvador in the mid-1980s. But there was one massive problem. By the time they returned to El Salvador, the country was in full-blown civil war, and there were already several gangs operating across the nation. So these refugees decided to join forces with an already existing gang called the 18th Street Gang. This alliance would eventually lead to the creation of MS-13. The name comes from the fact that the gang operates mainly along the 31st parallel north, which is the 13th parallel west of the Greenwich Meridian. Since then, MS-13 has grown exponentially. Today, they operate across multiple continents with members in the US, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. While they are now active in many Central American countries, their presence is strongest in El Salvador with around 40,000 members. Now let's talk about Barrio 18. The origins of Barrio 18 are much less clear than those of MS-13. What we do know is that the gang originated in San Salvador. During the Civil War, it acted as an independent group until merging with the 18th Street Gang in the mid-80s, just like MS-13. Although the two gangs joined together, they would soon part ways in the early 90s. The split was caused by a disagreement over territory and power. Once they split, both gangs began recruiting heavily and committing countless murders. At some point, Barrio 18 had even allied itself with the National Police Force. It's said that they gave the police weapons and intelligence in exchange for money and protection. Of course, as the years went on, things would change. And by 2005, Barrio 18 was no longer working with the police. Instead, they were now allied with the notorious Mexican drug cartel, the Beltran Levilla. Throughout the years, they have worked as the cartel's enforcement arm in El Salvador. Today, Barrio 18 is the second largest gang in El Salvador with around 25,000 members. So those are the two biggest gangs in El Salvador. But why are people joining them? Well, if you ask anyone from El Salvador, they will tell you that it all starts with poverty. El Salvador has had double-digit unemployment since the 1990s and extreme. Poverty affects 1 out of every 3 citizens. With such high levels of poverty, people have no other choice but to turn to gangs for help. In many cases, gangs will even help people find work. However, this work often involves illegal activities such as selling drugs, stealing cars, or even robbing banks. Education isn't much better either. Over 50% of the population is illiterate, and nearly 1 out of every 3 children doesn't go to school at all. Because of this, gangs have set up makeshift schools where they teach kids how to read and write. Sure, this might sound nice, but these so-called schools often turn kids into ruthless killers. In fact, there are stories of kids as young as 10 years old being recruited by these gangs. But if you think that being poor and uneducated is enough to make someone join a gang, you'd be wrong. You see, in El Salvador, it's not uncommon for people to be born into a gang. It's kind of like a hereditary thing. For example, if your father was a member of Barrio 18, you would automatically become a member upon birth. There is literally no escape. If you try to leave, Barrio 18 will kill you and your family. That's why thousands of people stay in these gangs, despite the danger. Of course, once you're in these gangs, life becomes a whole lot more complicated. Let me explain. Imagine that you live in a small neighborhood in El Salvador. Your entire neighborhood is controlled by a local gang. Every day you hear gunshots, people screaming, and women crying. You can't take it anymore, so you decide to move out and start fresh somewhere else. But where? You can't go anywhere in the country without running into that same gang. Even if you do manage to escape, you will never be able to get any kind of work because the gang will always be looking for you. They'll threaten your future employers and make sure that you never get hired. This is why thousands of Salvadorans flee their country each year. They would rather live in a foreign country without knowing anyone than stay in their own country and live in fear. In fact, this gang violence has gotten so bad that the Salvadoran government has had to take drastic measures. On March 27, 2023, the government declared a state of emergency. This means that citizens have no right to privacy, and the military has full authorization to search any home it wants. The military also has the authority to detain people without charging them or giving them a trial. Since the state of emergency was declared, over 64,000 people have been detained. But whether or not this will help remains to be seen. Some believe that it won't make any difference because these gangs are too powerful. They have bribed politicians, police officers, and judges. They even have their own currency. It's called the colon, and it's often stamped with gang symbols. Just imagine going to court for a crime. You did uncommit and having the judge accept money instead of handing down a guilty verdict. This has happened countless times in El Salvador. That's why many people say that there is no hope for their country. They're doomed to live in fear forever. Others, however, remain optimistic. They believe that the state of emergency will help bring the gangs to their knees. And if that happens, things could start looking up for El Salvador. Only time will tell what the future holds for this tiny nation. Will it continue to be a war-torn country filled with poverty and crime? Or will it finally become a beacon of hope for Central America? One thing's for sure though, the gangs have no intention of giving up. They've been fighting for decades, and they're not about to stop now. In 2019, El Salvador elected a new president by the name of Nayib Bukele. He was a political outsider with no experience in government who ran on an anti-gang platform promising to clean up the streets of El Salvador once and for all. The old guard of El Salvador tried to stop him. They underestimated this young leader who had spent years carefully crafting his public image. His massive social media following would help him get elected and then use his power to declare war on El Salvador's gangs. Over the course of the next few years, he would completely change the nation forever. This is the rise of Second. El Salvador has been plagued by two problems since its independence from the Spanish Empire in the early 1800s: corruption and gang violence. In the early days after independence, it was the corruption that plagued the country. There were coups, civil wars, and assassinations that kept El Salvador in a state of chaos. But as the 20th century rolled on, things started to settle down and the economy began to grow. By the 1970s, El Salvador had one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. Unfortunately, this prosperity was not shared by all. The gap between the rich and poor grew larger and larger, and by the 1980s, it exploded. This led to civil war between the poor, mostly indigenous masses, and the landowning elite. The war would last for 12 years and end with the signing of the Chapultepec Peace Accords in 1992. The accords granted amnesty to soldiers and guerrillas involved in the conflict and set up a system of justice for atrocities committed during the war. However, the underlying issues that caused the war in the first place were never really addressed. The ruling class still held most of the power, and the gangs formed by the guerrilla armies were left without purpose. After the peace accords were signed, the gangs turned their attention to the streets of El Salvador, where they began extorting money from local businesses. When the government tried to crack down on them, the gangs retaliated by launching attacks against police and government officials. Before long, the gangs had formed a formidable criminal underclass that seemed to be impossible to get rid of. Governments tried everything they could think of to defeat them, but nothing worked. And as the years went on, the gangs only grew stronger. So when Nayib Bukele came along and promised to wipe the gangs out, many people thought he was just another corrupt politician lying to the populace to get their vote. But Bukele was different. He wasn't part of the old guard. He was unafraid to take unpopular stances, and he genuinely wanted to make life better for the average Salvadoran. Unfortunately for El Salvador, Bukele didn't have any experience in government and didn't know the first thing about how to run a country. But what he lacked in experience, he more than made up for in heart. After taking office, he wasted no time in stamping his authority as president. One of his first acts was to announce that he would be breaking relations with Taiwan and establishing diplomatic ties with China. This was a huge deal because it meant that El Salvador would be getting billions of dollars in investment from China. This money would be used to fund social programs and infrastructure projects, which helped to buy him a lot of political support. With this backing, he began to turn his attention to the gangs. The first thing he did was launch a massive crackdown on gang leaders. Hundreds of them were arrested and sent to jail. Then he began to take steps to prevent the gangs from recruiting new members. He implemented a program called SECET, or Territorial Control Centers, which provided former gang members with job training and education. At the same time, he also launched a massive public awareness campaign aimed at discouraging young people from joining the gangs. All of these measures were very effective, and the gangs were being weakened. But then something unexpected happened. The gangs launched a full-scale attack against the government. It was the biggest and most ambitious attack they had ever launched, and it caught the government off guard. For 3 days, the gangs ran rampant through the streets of El Salvador. They attacked police stations, burned down buildings, and killed anyone who opposed them. It seemed like the gangs were going to win. But then Bukele made a decision that would change El Salvador forever. He declared war on the gangs. Under the new laws, gang members could be imprisoned for up to 45 years without parole. Soon, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans were taking arms into their own hands to fight back against the gangs. Entire communities rose up to defend themselves and their families. For the next few weeks, it was every man for himself. The streets of El Salvador descended into chaos as rival gangs fought each other in the streets. Entire neighborhoods were leveled as both sides battled for control. It looked like the entire country was going to descend into anarchy. But then something incredible happened. The citizens of El Salvador came together and pushed back against the gangs. It wasn't easy. Many innocent people lost their lives in the fighting. But eventually, the gangs were driven out of most of the major cities. By the time the dust had settled, more than 60,000 gang members had been arrested and sent to jail. The gangs were completely defeated, and El Salvador was finally free from their grip. But this victory came at a cost. The country was in ruins, and the economy was in sharp decline. Despite all this, Bukele refused to give up. He continued to work hard to improve the lives of the Salvadoran people, and slowly but surely, things began to turn around. The economy began to grow again, and foreign investment began to pour into the country. Today, El Salvador is a much safer and more prosperous place than it was before Bukele took office. Violent crime has been reduced by more than 80%, and the economy is growing at one of the fastest rates in Latin America. So how did he do it? How did a country that was being held hostage by vicious gangs suddenly become one of the safest countries in Latin America? The answer is simple. Really? It was a combination of factors. First, Bukele was able to take advantage of the fact that the gangs had grown weak in the years leading up to his election. They had become complacent and had not prepared for a serious crackdown. Second, Bukele was willing to do what previous leaders had not been willing to do: take unpopular measures to crack down on the gangs. And third, Bukele was able to rally the citizens of El Salvador around the cause. He gave them hope that there could be a better future for them and their children. And they responded by coming out in droves to support him. There are some who criticize Bukele for his heavy-handed tactics. Human rights groups have accused him of running a dictatorship, and some of his critics even believe that he is a modern-day fascist. But to the people of El Salvador, he is a hero. They finally feel like they live in a country that is theirs and that they can be proud of. As for the future of El Salvador, it looks bright. Under Bukele's leadership, the country is on the path to becoming one of the most prosperous and stable in Latin America. The gangs may be back, but now they know that El Salvador will not be intimidated by them. The people have spoken, and they want their country back. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button.